The Crossroads diner sat alone on Highway 666, its neon sign flickering against the desert darkness like a dying heartbeat. Inside, Serafina wiped down tables with hands that once wielded flaming swords, her swollen belly heavy with something that wasn't entirely human. The elderly couple who stumbled through her door at 3 a.m. looked harmless enough, weathered faces, desperate eyes, clutching each other like survivors of some unseen catastrophe. "Please," the old woman whispered, "can we stay till dawn?" What they didn't know was that Serafina had been exiled from heaven for falling in love with a demon. What they couldn't see was the black blood coursing through her unborn child's veins. And what they would never understand was that sunrise would trigger the birth of either salvation or damnation. When Serafina's eyes turned molten gold and her voice carried the weight of eternity, her answer didn't just freeze them, it stopped time itself. Because some requests aren't just about shelter, they're about choosing sides in a war between good and evil. But what happens when the person meant to protect humanity might be the very thing that destroys it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee cup in the old man's hand hung suspended mid-air, brown liquid frozen in droplets that defied gravity. His wife's mouth remained open, caught between words that would never come. Even the ancient ceiling fan had stopped its lazy rotation, leaving the diner trapped in a pocket of absolute stillness. Serafina felt the familiar weight of divine power coursing through her veins, though it was tainted now, corrupted by love, by choice, by the abomination growing within her womb. Time manipulation had always been one of her gifts, but since her fall, it came with consequences she couldn't predict. She moved carefully around the frozen tableau, studying the couple with eyes that could see through flesh to soul. They weren't entirely human either, she realized. Something ancient flickered beneath their weathered skin, something that predated the current age. Angels in disguise, perhaps, or demons playing a deeper game. The woman's purse lay open on the counter, revealing not identification or money, but a collection of peculiar artifacts, a vial of what looked like starlight, a compass that pointed in directions that didn't exist on earthly maps, and a photograph of a man with wings spread against a burning sky. Serafina's unborn child stirred violently, responding to the presence of these strangers. Pain shot through her abdomen, and she gripped the counter to steady herself. The child was getting stronger, more aware. Soon it would be powerful enough to break free on its own terms, and she wasn't sure she could control what emerged. Her lover, Malphus, had promised her the child would bridge two worlds, bring peace between heaven and hell. But as the pregnancy progressed, she sensed something darker in the creature's movements. Intelligence, yes, but also hunger. A terrible, endless hunger that seemed to grow with each passing hour. The diner's fluorescent lights began to strobe, casting eerie shadows that moved independently of their sources. Serafina released her hold on time gradually, allowing reality to seep back into the frozen moment. The coffee resumed its fall, splattering across worn linoleum. The ceiling fan groaned back to life with a mechanical wheeze. The elderly couple didn't seem to notice the temporal hiccup. They stood exactly as before, waiting for her response with desperate patience. "Dawn is still 3 hours away," Serafina said carefully, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. "Are you certain that's what you want?" The old woman stepped forward, her eyes now showing a familiar silver gleam that Serafina recognized from her time in the heavenly host. "We've been traveling a long time to find you, sister. The council sent us." "Ster." The word hit Serafina like a physical blow. These weren't random travelers seeking shelter. They were her former colleagues, angels dispatched to clean up heaven's mistakes, to clean up her. "The council disbanded me from their service," Serafina replied, one hand protectively covering her belly. "They have no authority here." "They have authority everywhere," the old man said, his own disguise beginning to fray at the edges. Wings of tarnished silver flickered in and out of visibility behind his shoulders, especially when the fate of both realms hangs in the balance. The child kicked again, harder this time, and Serafina doubled over. When she looked up, her eyes blazed with divine fire. You want to stay until dawn? Fine, but understand this. When the sun rises, my child will be born. And if you or the council try to interfere, I'll show you exactly why they feared me enough to cast me out in the first place. The diner's neon sign outside suddenly blazed brighter, casting the entire building in hellish red light, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the cloudless desert sky. The rain hammered against the diner's windows with renewed fury as Margaret helped Harold ease into the cracked vinyl booth. His breathing had grown more labored during their sprint from the car, and she could see the pain etched deeper into the lines around his eyes. 63 years of marriage had taught her to read every shadow that crossed his weathered face. "Better?" she asked, sliding in across from him. Harold managed a weak smile. "Much, though I think we picked the loneliest spot in creation to break down." The waitress approached their table with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid despite her obvious pregnancy. Up close, Margaret noticed something unusual about the young woman. Her skin seemed to possess an almost luminous quality, as if lit from within, and her dark hair held an impossible sheen that caught the diner's harsh fluorescent light and transformed it into something softer. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed at odds with the desolate atmosphere. "Please," Margaret replied. "And thank you again for letting us stay. I'm Margaret Holloway, and this is my husband Harold, Elena." The name rolled off her tongue like a prayer, and it's no trouble at all. As Elena poured their coffee, Margaret caught sight of her hands. Pale and delicate, they moved with an otherworldly grace, but there was something else. Faint, silvery lines that traced across her palms like scars, barely visible unless the light hit them just right. "How far along are you, dear?" Margaret asked, her maternal instincts stirring despite the strange circumstances. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly. 8 months. She paused, her dark eyes growing distant. "Though sometimes it feels like I've been carrying this child for an eternity." There was weight in those words that made Margaret's chest tighten with inexplicable unease. She glanced at Harold, who was studying Elena with the same puzzled expression he wore when working particularly challenging crossword puzzles. "Is there a father in the picture?" Harold asked gently. Something flickered across Elena's face. Pain, anger, or perhaps fear. There was. But some promises are meant to be broken, and some chains are meant to be severed. Her voice carried a bitterness that seemed too ancient for someone so young. The lights above their table flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows that made Elena's features appear almost ethereal. Margaret blinked. Certain her tired eyes were playing tricks on her, but for just an instant she could have sworn she saw something like wings casting shadows on the wall behind the young woman. "Are you feeling all right?" Elena asked, noticing Margaret's startled expression. "Just tired," Margaret lied, shaking her head to clear it. "It's been a long day." Elena nodded sympathetically and moved toward the coffee station. As she walked away, Margaret noticed her reflection in the dark window, or rather the lack of it. Where Elena should have been mirrored in the rain-streaked glass, there was only empty space, as if she existed in the diner but not in the world beyond its walls. Margaret gripped Harold's hand across the table. "Harold," she whispered urgently, "look at the window." But when Harold turned, Elena's reflection had returned, perfectly normal and unremarkable. He looked back at his wife with concern. "What is it, Maggie?" Before she could answer, Elena returned with a plate of sandwiches they hadn't ordered. "You need to eat," she said simply, setting the food before them. "It's going to be a long night." The certainty in her voice sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "What do you mean?" Elena's hand moved to her belly again, and this time Margaret was certain she saw something shift beneath the fabric of her uniform, a movement too sharp and defined to be a normal kick from an unborn child. "Some nights are different from others," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the storm outside. Some nights, the barriers between worlds grow thin, and things that should remain separate begin to bleed through. She turned back to them, and for a moment, her pupils seemed to reflect light like an animal's. Tonight is one of those nights. Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that the entire diner shook. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and in the brief darkness that followed, Margaret heard something impossible, the sound of massive wings beating against the storm. When the lights steadied, Elena was gone. The coffee pot sat abandoned on their table, still steaming, and the sandwiches remained untouched. Harold was staring at the empty space where she had been standing, his face pale. "Where did she go?" he whispered. Margaret looked around the diner, but they were completely alone. Even more disturbing, the silence that had settled over the building felt absolute, as if the storm outside had suddenly ceased. But when she looked toward the windows, rain still streaked the glass, and lightning still illuminated the darkness beyond. They were trapped between two realities, and Margaret was beginning to understand that their breakdown hadn't been coincidence at all. The coffee had gone cold in Martha's cup, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it anyway. Something about the way the fluorescent lights flickered overhead made her stomach churn, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Harold sat across from her, methodically working through his slice of apple pie, but she noticed his hands trembling slightly with each bite. "More coffee?" The waitress appeared beside their table so quietly that Martha jumped, her cup rattling against its saucer. Up close, the young woman was even more striking and unsettling. Her skin held an almost translucent quality, as if light passed through rather than reflecting off it. But it was her eyes that made Martha's breath catch. They were ancient, filled with a weariness that belonged to someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes. "No, thank you, dear," Martha managed, forcing a smile. "We're fine." The waitress, her name tag read Sera, nodded and moved away, but not before Martha caught sight of her profile. The pregnancy was more pronounced from the side, and there was something odd about the way the fabric of her uniform stretched across her belly. It seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. "Harold," Martha whispered, leaning forward. "I think we should go." Her husband looked up from his pie, fork suspended midway to his mouth. "Go? It's still pouring out there, and we've got nowhere else." A crash of thunder shook the building so violently that the windows rattled in their frames. The lights went out completely for a moment before the emergency generator kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly yellow glow. In that brief darkness, Martha could have sworn she saw something else, wings, massive and black, unfurling behind the counter where Sera stood. "Did you see that?" she hissed. Harold followed her gaze to where Sera was calmly lighting candles, her movements graceful despite her condition. "See what?" Before Martha could answer, the diner's front door chimed. A man entered, shaking rain from his coat. He was tall and pale, with sharp features that seemed carved from marble. His eyes swept the room before settling on Sera, and when they did, his expression shifted to something between hunger and reverence. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying a slight accent Martha couldn't place. Terrible weather. Sera's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders tensed, and she moved protectively toward the counter, one hand instinctively covering her belly. "We're closed," she said, though the neon sign in the window still glowed open in red letters. The man smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "I don't think you are." He gestured toward Martha and Harold. "These lovely people seem to be enjoying your hospitality." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. There was something wrong about the newcomer, something that made her skin crawl. The air around him seemed to shimmer with heat, and she caught the faint scent of sulfur. "Like I said," Sera's voice was steady but cold. "We're closed." The man's smile widened. "Come now, Sera. Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Sera's face went white. "You're not welcome here, Malthus." Harold's fork clattered to his plate. "Martha," he whispered urgently, "we need to leave, now." But when Martha turned toward the door, another figure stood there, a woman in a dripping raincoat, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like an animal's. Behind her, partially obscured by the rain-streaked windows, more shapes moved in the darkness outside. "Leaving so soon?" Malthus asked, not turning from Sera but somehow aware of their movement. "But the evening is just beginning." Sera stepped forward, and Martha gasped. The young woman's shadow on the wall behind her was wrong. Instead of human silhouette, vast wings spread across the surface, and something like a halo flickered around her head. "The child isn't ready," Sera said, her voice carrying a new authority that made the air itself vibrate. "You know the rules. You can't force the choice." Malthus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Rules? You fell from grace, darling. You don't get to invoke heaven's rules anymore." His gaze shifted to her belly, and his expression grew predatory. Besides, prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves, one way or another. Outside, the thunder had taken on a rhythmic quality, like massive wings beating against the sky. The woman by the door stepped forward, revealing a face that was beautiful and terrible, with skin that looked burned and healed over countless times. "The morning star sends his regards," she said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "He's so looking forward to meeting his newest sibling." Sera's hand moved to something at her throat, a pendant that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant, almost blinding flashes. "Tell your master that the child will choose its own path, just as I did." The temperature in the diner plummeted, and Martha's breath began forming clouds. Whatever was happening here was far beyond anything she could understand, but one thing was certain: they were trapped in the middle of something that would determine far more than whether they'd live through the night. The wind howled against the diner's windows with renewed fury, as if the storm itself had taken notice of what transpired within. Sera pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the child stir restlessly beneath her skin. The movement was different now, more urgent, more deliberate. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself, but the darkness behind her eyelids revealed flashes of what was coming: fire, screaming, wings torn from celestial backs. She opened her eyes quickly, focusing on the mundane reality of the diner. Harold had retreated to the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His wife Margaret sat beside him, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she stared out at the storm. They seemed so ordinary, so innocent. Yet their arrival had set something irrevocable in motion. "More coffee?" Sera asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Harold looked up, studying her face with those sharp blue eyes. "You're not what you appear to be, are you, dear?" The coffee pot trembled in Sera's grip. "I don't know what you mean." "The way you move," Margaret said softly, not turning from the window. "Like you're carrying more weight than just a baby. Like gravity affects you differently." Sera set the pot down carefully. These weren't ordinary travelers seeking shelter. The realization crept up her spine like ice water. "Who are you?" Harold smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Just two people trying to get home before it's too late." The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment Sera saw them as they truly were. The glamour fell away like shed skin, revealing eyes that held the depth of centuries and skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They weren't human. They were something far older, far more dangerous. "Collectors," she whispered. "Very good," Margaret said, finally turning to face her, "though we prefer the term acquisitions specialists." Sera's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The child within her kicked hard, as if sensing the threat. "The baby isn't due for another month." "Time has a way of accelerating when the cosmic balance tips," Harold said, rising from the booth. "And you, my dear, have been the fulcrum for quite some time." Thunder crashed overhead, but beneath its rumble, Sera heard something else, the sound of wings, not the gentle flutter of birds, but the massive displacement of air that came with beings built for celestial flight. They were coming. Both sides were coming. "You don't understand," Sera said, backing toward the kitchen. "This child, it's not what you think it is." "Oh, but we do understand," Margaret said, standing as well. A Nephilim, born of an angel's fall and human desire. The old stories speak of such children, how they could either bridge our worlds or tear them apart. The diner's front door rattled violently, though no wind could account for the force behind it. Sera felt her wings trying to manifest, the phantom limbs she'd lost burning with remembered pain. She'd given up her celestial form for love, for the chance at redemption, but now she wondered if the price had been too high. "The question," Harold continued, moving to block her path to the kitchen, "is whether your child will follow the path of salvation or destruction. Our employers have a vested interest in ensuring the latter." Sera's vision blurred as another contraction hit her, stronger this time. The baby was coming early, just as they'd said, but there was something they didn't know, something she'd kept hidden even from herself until this moment. "Your employers are wrong," she gasped, gripping the counter for support. "This isn't a Nephilim." The collectors paused, uncertainty flickering across their ancient faces. "The father wasn't human," Sera continued, her voice growing stronger despite the pain. "He was like me, a fallen angel who chose love over duty. This child carries the blood of two fallen celestial beings. It's something that's never existed before." The lights went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. But in that blackness, Sera began to glow with a soft, silver radiance that emanated from her skin. The baby kicked again, and with it came a pulse of power that made the building's walls tremble. "Impossible," Margaret breathed. "The first of a new kind," Sera whispered, "not bound by the old laws, not beholden to either heaven or hell. Free to choose its own path." The front door exploded inward, revealing figures wreathed in shadow and flame. At the same moment, the back door burst open, admitting beings clothed in light and righteousness. The diner had become a battleground, with Sera and her unborn child at the center. As the opposing forces faced each other across the small space, Sera felt the final contraction begin. Her child would be born here, now, in the space between worlds, while angels and demons prepared for war. The countdown had begun in earnest, and there was no stopping it now. The temperature inside the diner plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on the windows. Sera's breath came out in white puffs as she pressed herself against the counter, watching Harold's eyes roll back until only the whites showed. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that made the coffee cups rattle. "The Watchers have found you, daughter of the morning star. They come with chains forged in the fires of judgment." Eleanor grabbed her husband's arm, but Harold remained rigid, his body a conduit for something ancient and terrible. "The child stirs," he continued, his voice layering over itself like a chorus. "Light and darkness war within the womb. Choose now, before the choice is taken from you." Sera doubled over as another contraction seized her, but this one felt different, electric, as if lightning coursed through her veins. The lights overhead flickered violently, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like breaking glass echoed across the night. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the parking lot's edge. "What's happening to him?" Eleanor demanded, shaking Harold's shoulder. But the old man's gaze remained fixed on Sera, unblinking and terrible. "To crossroads approaches. Heaven sends its hounds, and hell opens its maw. The child must be born in sanctified ground, or all hope dies with the dawn." Sera's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of a booth to steady herself. "I don't understand," she gasped. "What crossroads? What choice?" The front door's bell chimed, though no one had opened it. The sound cut through the supernatural cold like a blade, and suddenly Harold collapsed into his chair, blinking rapidly as consciousness returned to his eyes. Eleanor caught him before he could fall completely. "Harold? Harold, what happened?" The old man looked around in confusion, then focused on Sera with genuine concern rather than otherworldly knowledge. I'm sorry, dear. I felt dizzy for a moment." "Are you all right? You look pale." But Sera wasn't listening to Harold's recovery. Her attention was fixed on the diner's front window, where the frost was beginning to form patterns, not random crystalline formations, but deliberate shapes. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, ancient script that seemed to writhe and shift when she tried to focus on it. Outside, the shapes in the darkness were getting closer. "We need to leave," she whispered, backing toward the kitchen. "We need to leave now." Eleanor looked up from tending to Harold. "What? Why?" "The storm." "Look at the windows." Eleanor turned and gasped. The frost patterns were spreading, covering more of the glass with their incomprehensible script. And beyond them, figures moved with too perfect coordination, their forms tall and angular against the storm. Sera felt another contraction building, stronger than before. This one brought with it a surge of heat that made the air around her shimmer. The frost on the windows began to melt in spiraling patterns, as if her body were generating some kind of energy field. The back exit she managed between gritted teeth. There's a service road that connects to the highway about 2 miles north. Harold struggled to his feet, supported by Eleanor. "What about your car?" "Won't matter if we're dead." Sera moved toward the kitchen, one hand supporting her belly, the other trailing along the wall for balance. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, as if she were walking through deep water. The figures outside had reached the parking lot. Through the melting frost, Sera could make out their faces, beautiful and terrible, with eyes that burned like stars. They moved with purpose, surrounding the diner in a wide circle but coming no closer. "They're waiting for something," Harold observed, his voice still carrying a slight tremor from whatever had possessed him moments before. Sera paused at the kitchen's threshold. "For the child to be born. They can't take what isn't yet in this world." "Then we have time," Eleanor said hopefully. Sera shook her head, wincing as another wave of pain rolled through her. "I'm in active labor. We have maybe an hour, probably less." The kitchen was darker than the main dining area, lit only by the emergency lighting that cast everything in a hellish red glow. Sera made her way to the back door, testing the handle. It turned easily, but when she tried to push the door open, it wouldn't budge. "It's not locked," she said, throwing her shoulder against it. "Something's blocking it from outside." Harold joined her, adding his weight to the effort, but the door remained immovable. Through the small window set into the upper half, they could see what looked like a wall of ice stretching up beyond the glass. "Trapped," Eleanor whispered. Sera sank against the door, exhaustion and despair weighing her down more than the pregnancy. "They're herding us, keeping us here until—" She trailed off as realization hit her. "Until sunrise." "Harold, what did you mean about sanctified ground?" The old man frowned, as if trying to remember a half-forgotten dream. "I'm not sure I said anything about—" His words were cut off by a sound that made them all freeze. Footsteps on the diner's roof, slow and deliberate, circling overhead like a predator sizing up its prey. The temperature in the diner plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on the windows. Sera's breath came out in visible puffs as she pressed her back against the counter, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Margaret grabbed Harold's arm, her fingernails digging through his sweater. "What's happening?" she whispered, though the words seemed to echo strangely in the suddenly cavernous space. The coffee in Harold's abandoned cup began to steam, then bubble, then boil, despite the frigid air. Sera watched it with growing dread. She'd seen this before, in the early days after her fall, when others like her had tried to find her. But this felt different, stronger, more desperate. "Get away from the windows," Sera commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made both elderly people immediately step back. "Whatever you do, don't look directly at anything that comes through that door." Outside, the wind had risen to a howling shriek that rattled the building's frame, but beneath it, Harold could swear he heard something else, a sound like massive wings beating against the storm. Margaret's rosary beads clicked frantically between her trembling fingers as she mumbled prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, Sera's voice came soft but clear. "They've found me." Her words carried centuries of resignation mixed with fierce maternal protectiveness. I'd hoped I had more time. A sound like breaking glass filled the air, though none of the windows had shattered. The darkness itself seemed to crack, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible beyond. Harold felt his mind recoil from what his eyes were trying to process. Geometries that shouldn't exist, colors that had no names, and behind it all, a presence so ancient and terrible that his knees buckled. "Don't look," Sera said again, more urgently. She moved through the darkness with impossible grace, her hand finding Margaret's shoulder. "Close your eyes, both of you." But Margaret had already seen too much. Her prayers had stopped, replaced by a low, keening sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. The rosary beads were glowing now, each one pulsing with a warm golden light that pushed back the oppressive darkness just enough to reveal Sera's face. Harold gasped. Where the waitress's eyes should have been, twin flames now burned, not the red of hellfire, but something pure and silver-white that spoke of heights no human was meant to reach. Ancient scars traced delicate patterns across her cheekbones, and when she moved, the air itself seemed to shimmer around her. "You're one of them," Margaret breathed. "An angel." Sera's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Was. Past tense matters in situations like these. She placed her other hand on her belly, and Harold could see that her fingers ended in what might have been claws or might have been light itself. But what's growing inside me, that's something else entirely. The presence outside pressed closer, and the very air began to vibrate with a sound too low for human ears, but felt in bones and teeth. The diner's walls groaned under pressure that wasn't entirely physical. Sera winced, doubling over slightly as her unborn child responded to whatever force was seeking them. "They want the baby," she gasped. "They think they can control what it becomes, shape it while it's still vulnerable." She straightened with obvious effort, her burning eyes fixed on something beyond the fractured darkness. "They're wrong." Margaret's rosary beads flared brighter, and she felt something she'd thought lost forever. Faith, pure and undiluted by years of doubt and disappointment. "What do you need us to do?" Sera looked at her with surprise that quickly transformed into something like hope. "You'd help me? Even knowing what I am?" "I know what you're protecting," Margaret replied firmly. Harold nodded beside her, his weathered hand finding his wife's free one and squeezing tight. The presence outside let out a sound that was part shriek, part song, part fundamental force of creation being torn apart. The diner shuddered, and several glasses behind the counter exploded into glittering fragments that hung suspended in the air like frozen stars. Sera closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the flames had intensified until they cast actual shadows. "Then we need to get to the basement. There's something down there that might buy us time." She paused, her expression growing grim. "But I have to warn you, once we go down those stairs, there's no going back to the world you knew. You'll see things that will change you forever." The suspended glass suddenly dropped, hitting the floor in a cascade of musical notes that sounded almost like laughter. Outside, something that might have been a voice began calling Sera's true name, a word in a language that predated human speech and made the diner's windows weep condensation that looked suspiciously like tears. Harold squeezed Margaret's hand tighter. "Lead the way." The coffee cup shattered against the linoleum floor, sending ceramic shards skittering beneath the counter. Sera's hands trembled as she stared at the spreading brown stain, her mind reeling from the old woman's words. The baby inside her kicked violently, as if responding to some unseen threat. "What did you just say?" Sera whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain hammering against the diner's windows. Margaret's weathered face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. "Your wings," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I can see them, broken, blackened at the edges like they've been burned." Frank grabbed his wife's arm. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" But the old woman shook him off, never taking her eyes from Sera. 40 years I've been having the dreams, the same dream night after night, a fallen angel carrying a child that would either damn us all or save us. And now here you are." Sera's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles white. The fluorescent lights above began to flicker erratically, casting dancing shadows across the empty diner. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the revelation. "You're mistaken," Sera managed. But even as she spoke, she could feel the phantom weight of her severed wings, the constant ache between her shoulder blades that never quite faded. "I'm just a waitress, I'm just—" "You're terrified," Margaret interrupted, stepping closer despite Frank's attempts to hold her back. "Because you know what's coming. You can feel it building, can't you? The choice is almost here." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sera gasped. For a moment, the world around her seemed to shimmer, reality bending at the edges. She caught a glimpse of herself as Margaret must see her, ethereal and terrible, with massive wings that hung in tatters, their once pristine feathers now charred and broken. The image lasted only a second before snapping back to the mundane reality of the roadside diner. "How?" Sera's voice cracked. "How can you see what I really am?" Margaret's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. "Because I've been chosen to witness it. The dreams showed me everything. Your fall from grace, your exile to this place between worlds. They showed me the prophecy too." Frank looked between the two women, his face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. "Margaret, you're scaring me." "What prophecy?" But before anyone could answer, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside and the sound of Sera's labored breathing. "It's starting," Margaret whispered. Sera felt it too, a pulling sensation deep in her chest, as if invisible chains were tightening around her heart. The baby's movements became frantic, and she doubled over with a pain that had nothing to do with normal pregnancy complications. This was something else entirely, something that made her very essence burn with familiar agony. "They've found me," she gasped. Through the rain-streaked windows, shapes began to materialize in the darkness. At first, they might have been mistaken for travelers seeking shelter, but as they drew closer, their true nature became unmistakable. Their movements were too fluid, too purposeful. Their eyes reflected the diner's red emergency lights like those of predators. "Who?" Frank demanded, finally finding his voice. "Who's found you?" "The choir," Sera replied, her hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "Heaven's enforcers. They've come to ensure the prophecy unfolds according to their design." Margaret pressed her face against the window, watching the approaching figures. "How many?" "Enough." Sera straightened, drawing on reserves of strength she'd thought lost forever. "They want the child. They believe they can control its destiny, shape it into their perfect weapon against the darkness." "And the other side?" Margaret asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. "Hell wants it too. They think the child will be their key to finally breaking through the barriers that keep them contained." Sera's voice grew harder. "Neither side cares about free will or the child's right to choose its own path." The shapes outside had stopped just beyond the circle of light cast by the diner's exterior fixtures. They waited with infinite patience, knowing their quarry had nowhere to run. The storm continued to rage around them, but they stood motionless, untouched by wind or rain. Frank backed away from the window, his face ashen. "What do they want with us?" "Witnesses," Margaret said quietly. "Every prophecy needs witnesses to make it real." Sera felt another contraction, but this one was different. Not painful exactly, but significant. Time was running out faster than she'd anticipated. The child would come soon, and when it did, the choice that would determine the fate of both heaven and earth would have to be made. She looked at the elderly couple who had stumbled into this cosmic drama, their ordinary human lives now inextricably woven into something far beyond their understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so very sorry you're here for this." The diner's fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, Sera felt the child within her stir with an intensity that made her gasp. The movement wasn't the gentle flutter of an unborn baby. It was purposeful, urgent, as if responding to some cosmic signal only it could perceive. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, the storm had transformed into something unnatural. Lightning struck in perfect geometric patterns, and the rain fell upward for brief, impossible moments before gravity reclaimed it. "It's starting," Margaret whispered, her weathered hands pressed against the glass. "The convergence. I can feel it in my bones." Frank moved closer to his wife, his earlier skepticism crumbling as he watched trees outside bend at angles that defied physics. "What convergence?" Sera doubled over as another wave of pain coursed through her. But this wasn't labor. It was something else entirely. The child was feeding, drawing power from the supernatural storm raging outside. She could feel its consciousness expanding, becoming aware of its dual nature, part divine light, part infernal darkness, teetering on the edge of choice. "The moment when heaven and hell converge on earth," Margaret explained, her eyes never leaving Sera's face. "When the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for the child to make its nature known. We have perhaps an hour before—" The front door exploded inward, though no wind had touched it. Through the opening stepped a figure that made the air itself recoil, tall and impossibly gaunt. With skin like parchment and eyes that held the depth of eternity, it wore the tattered remains of what might once have been celestial robes. "Seraphil," Sera breathed, recognizing her former commander, the angel who had cast her down for the sin of loving a mortal man. "Sister," Seraphil's voice resonated with harmonics that made the remaining windows crack. "You have caused quite the disturbance in the celestial sphere. Did you truly believe you could birth an abomination without consequence?" Sera straightened despite the pain racking her body. "This child is not an abomination. It's hope." "Hope?" Seraphil laughed, and the sound was like crystal shattering. "You carry the seed of both salvation and damnation, a being with the power to remake reality itself. The host cannot allow such chaos to enter the world." Behind Seraphil, more figures materialized from the storm. Angels, but not the benevolent guardians of human imagination. These were warriors of the Old Covenant, terrible in their perfect beauty, their wings spanning impossible distances in the confines of the diner. Frank grabbed a knife from behind the counter, his human instincts driving him to protect despite the futility of the gesture. "Stay away from her." One of the angels turned its burning gaze on him, and Frank screamed as divine fire seared his mind. Margaret caught him as he fell, whispering words in a language that predated human speech. The angel's attention shifted to her, puzzled by her resistance to its power. "Interesting," Seraphil mused. "The old woman carries protection. How unexpected." Margaret's hand found the small pendant at her throat, a piece of meteoric iron inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some of us remember the old ways, when angels were not always mankind's friends. The child kicked again, and this time the entire diner shook. Cracks appeared in the walls, spreading outward like a spider web. Through the fissures, glimpses of other realities bled through, worlds where humanity had never fallen, where demons ruled supreme, where angels and mortals lived in harmony. "You see?" Seraphil gestured to the chaos. "Already reality bends around the unborn. If it lives, if it chooses, everything you know will cease to exist." Sera pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the child's confusion and fear. It was aware now, sensing the cosmic forces arrayed against it, the weight of destiny crushing down before it had even drawn breath. She whispered to it, words of comfort in the tongue she had spoken before her fall. "And what if it chooses salvation?" She challenged Seraphil. "What if it brings paradise to earth?" "Then we will have lost control," Seraphil admitted with chilling honesty. "The natural order will be shattered, free will taken to its ultimate conclusion, chaos absolute." Margaret struggled to her feet, supporting the semi-conscious Frank. "Perhaps that's what the world needs. Perhaps your precious order has caused enough suffering." The angel commander's wings spread wider, filling the diner with blinding light. Perhaps. But that is not a choice we can allow mortals to make. Outside, the storm intensified. In the distance, other shapes moved through the unnatural lightning, darker forms rising from chasms that had torn open in the earth. The demons had sensed the convergence too, drawn by the promise of a child who might serve their purposes just as readily as heaven's. Sera felt her water break, the fluid shimmering with otherworldly light as it pooled on the floor. Time was running out, and the war for her child's soul was about to begin in earnest. The creature that had been masquerading as Harold stumbled backward, its borrowed face contorting as divine light burned through its stolen flesh. Where Sera's touch had landed, the skin bubbled and peeled away like melting wax, revealing something far more terrible underneath. "You cannot hide what you are from me," Sera whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the diner's windows vibrate. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered wildly, casting strobing shadows across the walls. The thing wearing Harold's form let out a sound that was part scream, part static, part dying radio transmission. Its eyes rolled back, showing only whites that pulsed with veins of black ichor. When it spoke again, multiple voices layered over each other in a cacophony of stolen words. "We know what grows inside you, fallen one, the morning star's greatest mistake, carried in the womb of his most beloved disappointment." The voices rose and fell like a tide of whispers. "Did you think your little masquerade would fool the hierarchy? Did you think they wouldn't send us to collect what belongs in the pit?" Ruth's real scream pierced the supernatural chaos as her husband's face began to slide away entirely, revealing something that hurt to look at directly. Geometric angles that shouldn't exist folded in on themselves, creating a visage that belonged to no earthly taxonomy of horror. "Harold!" Ruth lunged forward, but Sera caught her arm, pulling her back with surprising strength. "That isn't your husband anymore," Sera said, though her voice carried a note of sorrow. "I'm sorry, Ruth. It hasn't been Harold since you stopped at the gas station outside Millfield." The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. She doubled over, clutching her chest as the memories realigned themselves with this new terrible understanding. Harold's sudden insistence on taking the scenic route, his uncharacteristic silence during the drive, the way he'd looked at her in the rearview mirror when he thought she wasn't watching, not with love, but with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. The real Harold, Ruth gasped between sobs. "Where is he?" The creature's laugh was like breaking glass mixed with crying children. "Oh, sweet mortal woman, your mate served his purpose. His flesh, his memories, his love for you, all of it was so very useful. We consumed every last morsel of his devotion." Ruth collapsed to her knees, but her grief quickly transmuted into something fiercer. When she looked up, her elderly features were twisted with rage that seemed to surprise even the demon. "You bastards!" she snarled, and somehow her voice carried its own power now, as if witnessing the supernatural had awakened something dormant in her soul. Harold was a good man. He deserved better than being food for parasites. The demon's attention shifted back to Sera, dismissing Ruth as inconsequential. "The child will be born whether you cooperate or not, Angel. But how much suffering comes before that birth that remains negotiable?" Sera's wings unfurled fully now, spanning the width of the diner, their luminescence revealing the true scope of the danger surrounding them. Through the windows, more shapes moved in the darkness beyond the parking lot. The storm outside wasn't natural weather, it was a maelstrom of spiritual energy, a tear in reality that had allowed Hell's advance guard to slip through. "I fell for a reason," Sera said, her voice steady despite the pain that clearly racked her transformed body. "I chose love over obedience, free will over predestination. Do you really think I'll hand over my child to either heaven or hell?" The thing that had been Harold tilted its impossible head, studying her with alien curiosity. "You speak of choice as if you still have any." Look around you, Seraphil. Count the eyes watching from the darkness. Feel how the walls of reality grow thin. Your rebellion bought you 9 months of hiding, but the bill has come due. As if summoned by its words, the shapes outside the windows began to press closer. Through the glass, Ruth could see dozens of faces, some human, some decidedly not, all wearing expressions of hungry anticipation. The diner suddenly felt less like a shelter and more like a trap that had been slowly closing around them. Sera doubled over as another contraction seized her, this one stronger than the last. When the spasm passed, she looked up with grim determination etched across her features. "Ruth," she said quietly, "I need you to go to the kitchen. Behind the industrial freezer, there's a loose panel in the wall. Push it aside and you'll find a bag. Bring it to me, quickly. But now." Sera's command carried enough authority to move mountains. Ruth scrambled to her feet and hurried toward the kitchen, stepping carefully around the spreading pool of Harold's abandoned human blood. Behind her, she heard the demon's laughter growing louder, mixing with the sound of something large and terrible beating its wings against the storm outside. The countdown had begun, and morning felt impossibly far away. The temperature in the diner plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on the windows. Martha's breath came out in visible puffs as she pressed herself against Harold's trembling form. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Sera stood in the center of the dining area, her hands clutched protectively over her swollen belly. The pregnancy that had appeared so natural and human just hours ago now pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Veins of golden light traced patterns beneath her skin, spreading outward from her abdomen like lightning frozen in flesh. "They've found us," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the coffee cups vibrate on their tables. "The Seraphim Council has sent their hunters." Harold struggled to his feet, his arthritic joints protesting against the supernatural cold. "What hunters? What are you talking about?" Before Sera could answer, the diner's front door exploded inward. 3 figures stepped through the smoking doorframe, their forms wreathed in wings of burning silver. They moved with predatory grace, their faces bearing the terrible beauty of creatures never meant for mortal eyes. Each carried a sword that hummed with divine energy, the blades leaving trails of light in the frigid air. The lead hunter spoke, its voice like wind chimes made of broken glass. "Sariel, daughter of the Morning Star's rebellion, you stand in violation of the sacred covenant. Surrender the abomination you carry, and your punishment may yet show mercy." Sera's laugh held no humor, only bitter resignation. "Mercy from those who cast me down for daring to love? I think not, Raziel." The hunter called Raziel tilted its head, studying her with eyes like molten gold. "The child you bear is prophesied to bring either salvation or damnation to both realms. Such power cannot be left to chance, especially in the hands of one already fallen." "The prophecy speaks of choice," Sera countered, backing slowly toward the kitchen. "My child will choose their own path when the time comes." Martha watched in terrified fascination as Sera's human disguise began to crack and peel away like old paint. Beneath lay skin that shimmered with an inner radiance, and from her shoulders emerged wings that had once been white as fresh snow, but now bore feathers of deep midnight blue, each one edged in silver. "You want my child?" Sera's voice resonated with power that made the diner's windows rattle. "You'll have to go through me first." The battle erupted in a clash of supernatural forces that defied mortal comprehension. Sera moved with fluid grace, deflecting the hunter's burning swords with wings that sparked and flared upon contact. The air itself seemed to scream as divine energies collided, sending shockwaves that cracked the diner's walls and shattered every piece of glass in sight. Harold grabbed Martha's hand and pulled her behind the counter, both of them ducking as a stray bolt of celestial fire scorched the air where their heads had been. "This is insane," he gasped. "This can't be real." "It's real," Martha replied, watching as Sera spun through the air, her wings creating barriers of shadow that absorbed the hunter's attacks. God help us, it's all real. One of the hunters broke away from the main fight, its golden eyes fixing on the elderly couple. Mortals, it intoned, raising its sword. You have witnessed what was not meant for human sight. Your silence must be ensured. The blade descended in a perfect arc, its holy fire reflecting in Harold's terrified eyes. But before it could strike, Sera appeared between them, her own hands wreathed in darkness that swallowed the divine light. No, she snarled, her face transformed by protective fury. They are under my protection. The force of her counterattack sent the hunter crashing through the far wall, its wings leaving gouges in the concrete. But the effort cost her, and Sera stumbled, one hand pressed to her belly as golden blood seeped between her fingers. Raziel pressed the advantage, its sword cutting through the air toward Sera's exposed back. She turned too slowly, weakened by her pregnancy and the toll of battle. The blade would have found its mark, if not for Harold's sudden cry of warning. Sera spun and caught the sword between her hands, her palms sizzling against the holy metal. For a moment, the two celestial beings stood locked in deadly stalemate, their powers crackling and writhing around them. Then, Sera smiled, and her midnight wings spread wide. You made one mistake, old friend, she said through gritted teeth. You assumed I was still fighting alone. The child in her womb pulsed once, sending a shockwave of pure energy that threw all three hunters backward. As they struggled to regain their footing, Sera's voice rang out with desperate urgency. Harold, Martha, the basement, now. There's a safe room behind the furnace. Go before they recover. The temperature inside the diner plummeted so suddenly that frost began forming on the windows. Sera's breath came out in visible puffs as another contraction seized her, this one so violent it brought her to her knees behind the counter. The baby was coming, and with it, something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Margaret rushed to Sera's side, her nursing instincts overriding the supernatural terror surrounding them. Harold, clear that booth. We need a clean surface. Her voice cut through the chaos with professional authority, even as shadows writhed across the walls like living things. The diner's lights flickered erratically, casting everything in a strobing nightmare of illumination and darkness. Through the frost-covered windows, shapes moved in the storm, tall, angular forms that definitely weren't human. They circled the building like predators, their presence making the very air hum with malevolent energy. They're testing the barriers, Sera gasped between contractions, her hand pressed against her swollen belly. The birth. It's weakening everything I've built here. Harold swept the condiments and napkin dispenser from the red vinyl booth, his hands shaking. What barriers? What the hell is out there? Sera's eyes rolled back, showing only white for a terrifying moment before she focused on him. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made their bones vibrate. Demons, angels, everyone who has a stake in what this child becomes. They've been waiting for this moment. Another contraction hit, and the lights exploded in a shower of sparks. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red. The coffee maker erupted with scalding steam, and the ancient jukebox began playing a warped, discordant version of an old hymn. Margaret helped Sera to the makeshift delivery area, her medical training warring with the impossibility of their situation. Sera, I need you to breathe. Focus on your breathing, not on whatever's happening out there. But breathing was becoming increasingly difficult for all of them. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against their lungs like invisible hands. Harold found himself praying, something he hadn't done since his army days, as he gathered every clean towel and tablecloth he could find. The first impact against the diner's walls came like thunder. The building shuddered, sending dishes crashing from the shelves. A second impact followed, then a third, each one stronger than the last. Cracks appeared in the windows, spreading like spider webs. The wards won't hold much longer, Sera said through gritted teeth. Her human appearance was beginning to slip. Her skin took on an otherworldly luminescence, and when she opened her eyes, they blazed with golden fire. Once they break through, she didn't need to finish. Harold could see it in her expression. Whatever was outside would kill them all to get to the child. Margaret positioned herself between Sera's legs, her hands steady despite everything. I can see the head. Sera, when the next contraction comes, I need you to push. The walls groaned under another assault. This time something cracked, not just the physical structure, but something deeper. The temperature rose suddenly, shifting from Arctic cold to desert heat in seconds. The scent of sulfur mixed with something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in the sun. Sera's scream of labor mixed with something else, a sound that was part battle cry, part prayer. Light exploded from her body, momentarily blinding them all. When their vision cleared, her wings were visible again, spread wide and radiating power that made the fluorescent emergency lights seem dim by comparison. "It's coming!" Margaret shouted over the supernatural chaos. "The baby's coming!" Another section of the barrier shattered. Through the breach, Harold caught a glimpse of what waited outside. Faces that were beautiful and terrible, eyes like burning coals, forms that shifted between human and something far more ancient. The fallen and the faithful, locked in an eternal war that was about to claim a new battlefield. Sera's wings fluttered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "The child will choose," she gasped. "That's why they're all here. The moment of birth, the soul decides." The next contraction brought a sound that wasn't quite human, a cry that seemed to come from the space between worlds. The diner's structure groaned, reality itself bending under the weight of what was being born. Margaret worked with desperate efficiency, her hands guided by decades of experience and something deeper, a divine purpose she was only beginning to understand. "One more push, Sera. I can see the shoulders." The final barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking crystal. Wind howled through the diner, carrying voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The forces outside began pouring in, filling the space with their terrible presence. But Sera was ready. Her wings spread wider, and she pushed with everything she had left, crying out in a voice that held both the fury of the damned and the hope of the saved. The child entered the world in a burst of light and shadow, its first cry echoing across dimensions. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost began forming on the diner's windows. Clara's breath came in visible puffs as she pressed her back against the counter, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Harold stepped protectively in front of Martha, his weathered hands trembling as much from fear as from the sudden cold. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing wind that howled through cracks in the building's foundation. The old woman behind them, the one who had claimed to be seeking shelter, slowly straightened from her hunched posture. Her frail appearance began to melt away like wax near flame, revealing something far more terrible beneath. Her eyes burned with an inner fire that cast red light across her transformed features. "The time for pretense has passed," she said, her voice no longer weak and quavering but rich with ancient malice. "The child stirs. I can feel its power calling to me." Clara's baby kicked violently, as if responding to the demon's presence. Pain shot through her abdomen, and she doubled over with a gasp. The child within her was fighting something, or perhaps fighting to break free. "You won't touch her," Harold said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. He had no idea how an ordinary man like him could stand against such evil, but something deep inside refused to let him step aside. The demon that wore an old woman's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Touching won't be necessary. The child knows its true nature now. Feel how it struggles against the prison of flesh." Martha moved to Clara's side, ignoring Harold's protective gesture. Her nursing instincts overrode her fear as she helped support the young woman. "Breathe, honey. Whatever's happening, you need to stay calm for the baby." But calm seemed impossible. The very air in the diner had become charged with supernatural energy. Plates rattled on shelves, and the cash register's drawer shot open with a violent crash. The smell of sulfur began to overpower the lingering sense of coffee and pie. "It was always meant to be this way," the demon continued, circling them like a predator savoring the hunt. "Do you think your arrival here was coincidence? Do you think any of this happened by chance?" Her gaze fixed on Harold and Martha. "You were drawn here, called by forces beyond your comprehension, witnesses to the birth that will reshape existence itself." Clara straightened with visible effort, her green eyes blazing with defiance despite her pain. "My child won't be your weapon. Whatever I was before, whatever sins I carry, this baby is innocent." "Innocent?" The demon's laugh grew more shrill, the offspring of a fallen angel, conceived in defiance of divine law. "There is no innocence here, only potential. Potential for glorious destruction." The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the demon's burning eyes and a faint golden glow that seemed to emanate from Clara herself. In that otherworldly illumination, Harold could see something he'd missed before. The waitress wasn't just pregnant, she was transforming, her human disguise falling away to reveal the magnificent and terrible truth of what she really was. Wings, translucent and shot through with veins of light, began to unfold from her shoulders. Her face remained human, but took on an ethereal beauty that was almost painful to look upon directly. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in their bones. "I fell from grace, yes, but I fell toward love, not away from it. This child was created in hope, not hatred." The demon hissed and took a step back. Pretty words. But hope and hatred often wear the same face. The child will choose its nature soon enough, and when it does, I will be here to guide that choice. Martha found her voice, though it shook with terror. "What do you mean, choose?" Clara's wings spread wider, nearly touching the diner's walls. "All children of fallen angels must choose their path when they first draw breath. Heaven or hell, redemption or damnation. The choice shapes not just their soul, but their power. And such power this one will wield," the demon purred. "Enough to tear the barriers between worlds, enough to bring my master's kingdom to earth, or—" She paused, her expression twisting with disgust. "To strengthen the failing barriers and trap us in the pit for another age." Harold felt the weight of cosmic significance pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a woman giving birth. This was about the future of everything, every person he'd ever loved, every sunset he'd ever watched, every small moment of joy or sorrow that made up a human life. "How long?" he asked quietly. Clara met his eyes, and in them he saw both infinite sadness and determined hope. "Soon. The contractions are getting stronger. My child will be born before dawn." The demon smiled, revealing teeth like broken obsidian. "Then we wait. And when the moment comes, we shall see which voice the child hears first, its mother's prayers or my promises of power." The temperature in the diner plummeted as shadows began pooling in the corners, defying the fluorescent lights overhead. Sera's breath came in visible puffs as she pressed her back against the counter, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The child within her kicked frantically, as if sensing the approaching darkness. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the windows rattle. "The Watchers have found us." Harold grabbed Martha's trembling hand, pulling her toward him as the air grew thick with an oppressive energy that made their skin crawl. Outside, the wind howled with voices that spoke in tongues they didn't recognize but somehow understood carried promises of torment. The first shadow materialized near the door, tall and writhing, its form constantly shifting between human and something far more terrible. Its eyes burned like dying stars, ancient and filled with malevolent intelligence. More shadows gathered behind it, their whispers creating a symphony of dread that seemed to seep into their very bones. "The half-breed carries our brother's essence," the lead shadow spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "She has stolen what belongs to the void." Sera straightened, her human facade beginning to crack as ethereal light emanated from her skin. her hair lifted as if caught in an invisible wind. And when she spoke, her words carried the weight of celestial authority. "I chose love over duty. The child is mine to protect." The shadow thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Love? You speak of love while carrying an abomination that could tear apart the very fabric of existence. The Council of Shadows has decreed the child must be returned to us before its birth." Harold's practical mind struggled to process what he was witnessing, but his protective instincts kicked in anyway. He positioned himself between Martha and the supernatural entities, his weathered farmer's hands steady despite the impossible situation. "She's under our protection," he declared, surprising himself with his boldness. The shadow turned its burning gaze toward him, and Harold felt his soul being examined and weighed. "Mortal man, you know not what you defend. This child could become humanity's greatest salvation or its ultimate destroyer. The risk is too great." "All children carry that potential," Martha said quietly, stepping out from behind her husband. Her voice shook, but her resolve was clear. "That's what makes them precious." Sera's eyes widened as she felt the first contraction grip her body. The timing couldn't be worse, or perhaps it was exactly as fate had ordained. The child was coming, and with it, the moment of truth that would determine which nature would dominate, the divine light inherited from its mother's original grace, or the shadow essence of its fallen father. The shadows pressed closer as Sera doubled over in pain. With each contraction, the lights in the diner flickered between brilliant white and deep crimson. The very air seemed to crack and splinter around them, revealing glimpses of other realms beyond the veil of reality. "The birth begins," the lead shadow hissed with anticipation. "Soon we will reclaim what was taken from our realm." Sera looked up at Harold and Martha, her face a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "I need you to promise me something. If the darkness wins, if my child emerges as the destroyer the shadows hope for, you must not let it leave this place." Martha moved to Sera's side without hesitation, taking her hand despite the supernatural heat radiating from her skin. "How could we possibly stop such a creature?" "Free will," Sera gasped between contractions. "Even beings of immense power must choose their path. Show it love, show it the beauty of human compassion, and perhaps the light will prevail over the shadow." The shadows circled them now, their forms growing more solid and menacing as the moment of birth approached. Harold could see other shapes moving in the darkness beyond the windows, an army of supernatural entities drawn by the cosmic significance of what was about to unfold. Another contraction racked Sera's body, and this time the very foundations of the diner shook. Cracks appeared in the walls, revealing glimpses of burning landscapes and frozen wastelands where tortured souls wandered in eternal punishment. The boundary between dimensions was weakening with each moment that brought the child closer to existence. "The barriers are failing," the shadow entity observed with satisfaction. "When the child draws its first breath, the seals will shatter completely. Our realm will bleed into yours, and the age of human dominance will end." Sera's scream of pain transformed into a sound that was part agony, part celestial song. The fluorescent lights exploded in showers of sparks, plunging them into a darkness illuminated only by the supernatural glow emanating from her body. In that moment, Harold and Martha realized they stood at the epicenter of a battle that would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of every living soul on earth. The child was coming, and with it, either humanity's salvation or its doom. The diner shuddered as another wave of demonic energy crashed against its weakening barriers. Sera pressed her back against the counter, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly as the child within her stirred restlessly. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. "How much longer can this place hold?" Harold asked, his weathered face pale as he watched cracks spider across the windows. His wife Martha clutched his arm, her knuckles white with tension. "Not long enough," Sera whispered, feeling the protective wards Marcus had placed around the building beginning to fray. Outside, the howling had grown louder, more insistent. The legion of demons had been testing their defenses for hours, probing for weaknesses like predators circling wounded prey. Marcus stood near the front door, his blade gleaming with an otherworldly light. Blood seeped through his shirt from wounds sustained in the earlier battle, but his stance remained resolute. "Sera, we need to talk about the choice," he said without turning around. "Time's running out." She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of claws scraping against glass, the whispered promises of power that seemed to seep through the walls. The choice. It always came back to that. Embrace her fallen nature and give birth to a child of darkness, or somehow find redemption and bring forth a being of light. But how could she choose when both paths seemed impossible? "There's something you need to know," Martha said suddenly, her voice trembling but determined. She pulled away from Harold's protective embrace and walked towards Sera. "About why we really came here tonight." Sera's eyes snapped open. "What do you mean?" Harold shook his head frantically. "Martha, no, we agreed." "Look around us, Harold." Martha's voice cracked with emotion. "This isn't coincidence anymore. We can't pretend it is." She turned back to Sera, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We had a daughter once. Her name was Grace." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Marcus finally turned from his vigil, his expression grave. Outside, the howling suddenly ceased, as if the demons themselves were listening. "She would have been about your age now," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We lost her when she was 16. Car accident. But before she died—" She paused, struggling with the words. She had visions, dreams about angels and demons, about a child who would change everything. She drew pictures, wrote in journals, about a place that looked exactly like this diner. Sera's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "That's impossible." "We've been searching for 40 years, Harold said quietly, his own tears flowing freely now, following her drawings, her descriptions. "Grace said we would know when we found it, when we found you. She said we had a role to play." A thunderous crack split the air as one of the front windows finally shattered. Icy wind rushed in, carrying with it the stench of sulfur and decay. Marcus raised his blade as shadows began pouring through the opening, but instead of attacking, they formed a circle just outside the remaining barrier. "The old woman speaks truth," a voice hissed from the darkness. It was different from the others, older, more refined, dripping with ancient malice. "The child Grace saw much, too much. We silenced her before she could reveal our plans." "No," Martha gasped, stumbling backward. "You said it was an accident. The police said—" "The police saw what we wanted them to see," the voice continued with cruel amusement. "Just as we have guided you here, to this moment. Did you truly think you were choosing your own path? You are pawns in a game older than your species." Sera felt something shift inside her, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. "You wanted them here. You wanted me to hear this." "Pain makes the choice easier," the demon purred. "Despair opens doors that hope keeps locked. Feel it, fallen one. Feel how your protectors have been manipulated, how their daughter's death was orchestrated to bring them to you at your most vulnerable moment. Let that agony fuel your decision." The child in Sera's womb suddenly kicked violently, as if responding to the malevolent presence beyond the walls. She doubled over, crying out as waves of supernatural energy coursed through her body. The moment was approaching. She could feel it building like pressure before a storm. Marcus moved to her side, supporting her weight. "Don't listen to them, whatever they want you to feel, whatever they're trying to manipulate." "But it's working," Sera gasped, looking up at Martha and Harold's devastated faces. "I can feel the darkness growing stronger, the pain, the anger. It's exactly what the child needs to be born as a destroyer." The shadows outside writhed with anticipation. The final test had begun, and the demons believed they had already won. The earth beneath the diner cracked with a sound like thunder, and Sera felt the child within her respond with violent movement. Each kick sent waves of celestial energy rippling through her body, making her skin glow with an otherworldly light that pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. "It's starting," she gasped, gripping the counter as another contraction seized her. This wasn't labor. Not yet. This was something far more terrifying. The child was awakening to its power, and with each pulse of energy, the barriers between worlds grew thinner. Margaret rushed to her side, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as they supported Sera's trembling form. "Harold, help me get her to the back room." "No," Sera shook her head violently. "We can't leave the dining area. The protective circle, if I move too far from it now, while the child is this active, the demons will sense the opening." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the diner plummeted. Their breath became visible in crystalline puffs, and the windows began to frost over despite the warm summer night outside. Through the growing ice on the glass, dark shapes moved with predatory grace. Harold pressed his face against the window, then jerked back as something with too many teeth smiled at him from the other side. "There's dozens of them out there, maybe hundreds." The lights flickered, and in the brief darkness, otherworldly shrieks echoed from every direction. When the fluorescent bulbs steadied, long scratches had appeared on the walls, claw marks that hadn't been there moments before. Sera doubled over as another wave of energy coursed through her. Where her tears hit the linoleum floor, small flowers bloomed instantly, their petals radiating a soft golden light. "The child is fighting," she whispered. "It knows what's coming. It's trying to choose." "Choose what?" Margaret asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. "Whether to be humanity's salvation or its destroyer." Sera's eyes rolled back, showing only white for a terrifying moment before focusing again. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The demons whisper to it constantly now. They show it visions of a world where it rules over the ashes of everything good, where pain is currency and hope is extinct. The jukebox in the corner suddenly roared to life, cycling through songs at impossible speed. The music warped and twisted, becoming a cacophony of screams and hymns that made Harold cover his ears and sink to his knees. "But there are other voices too," Sera continued, her voice cutting through the supernatural chaos. "Angels who haven't fallen. They sing to the child of light, of the beauty that exists in mortal hearts, of love that transcends understanding." Margaret grabbed Sera's shoulders, looking directly into her luminous eyes. "Which voices are stronger?" A sob escaped Sera's lips. "I don't know. The child feels my fear, my anger at what I've lost. Every moment of bitterness I've harbored feeds the darkness growing inside it." She pressed her hands to her swollen belly. "My own emotions might damn the world." The scratching at the windows intensified, joined by an inhuman howling that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. Cracks spider-webbed across the glass, but still the protective barriers held. Harold struggled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "Then we change what the child feels." "How?" Sera asked desperately. "By showing it something else." He looked at his wife, and Margaret nodded with understanding born of 60 years together. "By showing it what love really looks like." Margaret took Sera's left hand while Harold grasped her right. The moment their skin made contact, Sera gasped. Through their touch she felt the depth of their connection, not just to each other, but to everyone they'd ever helped along their endless journey. She saw Harold working double shifts to pay for a neighbor's medicine, Margaret staying up all night to nurse a sick child who wasn't even their own. "We've been traveling these roads for longer than you might think," Margaret said softly. "Always looking for places where we're needed most. Tonight, we're exactly where we're supposed to be." The golden light emanating from Sera's skin intensified, but now it was joined by a softer, warmer glow that seemed to come from the elderly couple themselves. Where their hands touched hers, the frantic movement in her womb began to calm. "Feel this," Harold whispered, and somehow Sera knew he was speaking not just to her, but to the child within. "Feel how love multiplies when it's shared, how it grows stronger in the face of darkness." For the first time since the supernatural assault began, the scratching at the windows paused. The demons outside seemed confused by this new development, uncertain how to combat something as simple and powerful as three people choosing connection over fear. But Sera knew this was only the beginning. The child's birth was still hours away, and with each passing moment, the final battle for its soul and the world's fate drew inevitably closer. The diner shuddered as reality itself began to fracture. Through the windows, the world outside flickered between dimensions, one moment showing the familiar desert highway, the next revealing glimpses of burning cities and ash-filled skies. Sera pressed her hands against her swollen belly, feeling the child within responding to the cosmic upheaval with violent kicks that sent waves of pain through her abdomen. "It's starting," she gasped, doubling over as another contraction seized her. "The birth. I can't control it anymore." Margaret rushed to her side, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she helped Sera to a chair. "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." Sera's voice cracked with desperation. "The barriers between worlds are dissolving. When the child crowns, that's when the choice must be made." Harold had positioned himself by the door, though what good it would do against the forces gathering outside remained unclear. The temperature in the diner plummeted, their breath forming clouds as an otherworldly wind howled through cracks that hadn't existed moments before. "What choice?" Margaret demanded, her nursing instincts taking over as she examined Sera. "What exactly are we supposed to do?" Sera's eyes rolled back, showing only whites for a terrifying moment before snapping back to focus. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the windows rattle. "The child will emerge balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and damnation. In that first moment, before it draws breath, its nature will be determined by the dominant force present." Another contraction racked her body, and the lights in the diner exploded in showers of sparks. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a hellish red glow that made their shadows dance like demons on the walls. "Dominant force!" Harold called out, his voice barely audible over the supernatural storm building around them. "Love or fear?" Sera panted. "Compassion or judgment? The energy that fills this space when the child takes its first breath will shape its essence forever." She gripped Margaret's hand with inhuman strength. "That's why you're here. That's why an old couple seeking shelter triggered all of this. Your hearts, your intentions, they matter more than any weapon or ritual." The floor beneath them began to crack, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible moving in the depths below. Through the fissures came the sound of countless voices, some singing in languages older than human civilization, others screaming in anguish that pierced straight to the soul. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood. The kindness we showed each other, the way Harold protected you, the way we've cared for each other despite the horror. "Yes," Sera whispered, her body convulsing as another wave of pain struck. "But there are other forces at work too, ancient hatreds, the accumulated weight of human cruelty and suffering. They're all converging here now." The diner's walls had become translucent, showing glimpses of the spiritual battle raging just beyond perception. Massive forms moved through the darkness, some radiant with divine light, others twisted with malevolent power. They pressed against the thin membrane of reality, waiting for the moment when the child's arrival would tear it completely open. Harold abandoned his post at the door and knelt beside his wife. "Then we fill this place with everything good we've ever known," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Every moment of love, every act of kindness, every time we chose hope over despair." Sera nodded, tears mixing with sweat as her body prepared for the final stage of labor. "Remember who you are," she urged them. "Not perfect people, but good people, people who saw a stranger in need and opened their hearts without question." The supernatural wind reached a howling crescendo, and cracks spread across the ceiling like a spider web. Through them, stars were visible, but they were wrong stars, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Some pulsed with warm golden light, while others burned with cold fire that seemed to drain warmth from the world. Margaret squeezed Sera's hand and began to speak, her voice cutting through the chaos. She told of quiet Sunday mornings with Harold, of children they'd helped raise, of small kindnesses exchanged with neighbors over decades of ordinary life. Harold joined in, sharing memories of Sera's gentle care for weary travelers, of the way she'd always had a kind word for anyone who needed it. As they spoke, something shifted in the air around them. The malevolent presence pressing against the diner's walls seemed to recoil slightly, while the golden light grew stronger. Sera felt it too, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her angelic nature and everything to do with simple human decency. But the battle was far from over. With each contraction, reality buckled further. The choice that would determine the fate of both heaven and earth was moments away, and the forces of darkness weren't finished yet. Sera screamed as the final stage of labor began, her voice harmonizing with both celestial choirs and infernal howls as the universe held its breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered one final time before plunging the diner into absolute darkness. Sera's screams pierced the void as another contraction seized her, more violent than any before. The child within her was fighting to be born at the exact moment when the veil between worlds had grown gossamer thin. Margaret fumbled through the blackness toward the sound of Sera's voice, her arthritic hands extended like a blind woman's. "I'm here, dear. I'm coming." The temperature in the diner had plummeted so drastically that her breath formed visible clouds even in the pitch black. Harold's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene from nightmare. Sera writhed on the floor behind the counter, her waitress uniform soaked with perspiration despite the bitter cold. But it wasn't sweat that gleamed on her skin. It was something that shimmered with an otherworldly luminescence, like liquid starlight. "The baby's coming," Sera gasped between contractions. I can't hold it back anymore." Outside, the wind had risen to a howling crescendo that threatened to tear the roof from the diner. Through the windows they could see shapes moving in the storm, massive, writhing forms that defied comprehension. Some bore wings that blotted out sections of the sky, while others moved with serpentine grace across the frozen ground. Heaven and hell had marshaled their forces, and the battle lines were drawn across the Nebraska wasteland. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Sera, her nursing instincts overriding her terror. "Harold, bring me every clean towel you can find, and boil water if the gas still works." "There's no time for that," Sera whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the remaining intact windows vibrate. "The child comes now, with the convergence. Every choice we've made, every moment of kindness or cruelty has led to this." Harold's hands shook as he gathered supplies, the reality of their situation finally crushing down on him. "Sera, tell us what we need to do. How do we make sure your baby chooses to save humanity instead of destroying it?" Sera's laugh was bitter and beautiful, like silver bells tolling a funeral dirge. "Don't you understand yet? The choice isn't the baby's, it was never the baby's." Another contraction racked her frame, and with it came a sound like thunder rolling across the plains. "The child will be what we make it, what humanity deserves." The truth hit Margaret with crystalline clarity. "You're saying the baby will reflect us? Our actions tonight, our choices, they're determining its nature." "Every act of compassion strengthens the light within it," Sera confirmed through gritted teeth. "Every moment of selfishness feeds the darkness. You came here tonight as strangers, and you've chosen to stay and help me. That matters. That's writing itself into the child's very essence." A tremendous crash shook the diner as something massive struck the building's exterior wall. Cracks spiderwebbed across the windows that hadn't already shattered, and through the gaps came the sound of inhuman voices raised in battle cries that predated language itself. Harold positioned himself at Sera's head, his weathered face set with determination. "Then we'll make sure this child knows nothing but love from its first breath. Margaret, what do you need me to do?" "Hold her steady," Margaret said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used in delivery rooms decades ago. "Sera, on the next contraction, I need you to push with everything you have left." The fallen angel's wings, which had remained hidden throughout their time together, finally unfurled behind her shoulders. They were magnificent and terrible. Feathers the color of storm clouds shot through with veins of silver fire. Some feathers hung bent and broken, testament to her fall from grace, but others gleamed with residual divinity. "I can see the head," Margaret announced, her voice filled with wonder, despite the chaos surrounding them. "Just a little more, dear one." Outside, a voice like grinding mountains bellowed across the storm. "The child will be ours, fallen one. You cannot change what was ordained." Another voice answered, this one ringing with the purity of crystal chimes. "She is not yours to command, fallen morning star. The child's fate remains unwritten." Sera's eyes met Harold's in the flashlight beam, and he saw in them all the sorrow and hope of a creature caught between worlds. "When the baby comes," she whispered urgently, "the first face it sees, the first voice it hears. These will matter more than you know. Whatever happens to me, promise you'll be here for those first moments." "We promise," Margaret said firmly, her hands working with practiced efficiency despite the supernatural forces raging around them. "Now push, Sera. It's time to bring your child into the world." The final contraction built like a tsunami, and with it came a light that penetrated even the supernatural darkness. The moment of birth was upon them, and with it, the moment that would determine whether dawn would ever break again over the earth. The final contraction seized Sera like a vice of divine fire, and she knew this was it. The fluorescent lights above flickered wildly as her scream pierced the air, a sound that seemed to tear through dimensions. Outside, the storm had reached an impossible crescendo, lightning striking the ground in rapid succession, each bolt carving symbols into the earth that glowed briefly before fading. Margaret held Sera's hand as Harold positioned himself at the foot of the makeshift birthing area they'd created using booth cushions. His weathered hands, which had delivered countless calves on their farm over the decades, trembled slightly as he prepared to catch whatever was coming into this world. "I can see the head," Harold called out, his voice steady despite everything. "Sera, you need to push with the next one." The windows of the diner suddenly exploded inward, but instead of glass, a shower of what looked like crystalline feathers scattered across the floor. The temperature plummeted, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Sera's eyes rolled back, revealing nothing but white, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the building's very foundation vibrate. "The seals are breaking," she gasped between contractions. "I can feel them, one by one." Margaret squeezed her hand tighter. "You can do this, dear. Whatever happens, we're here with you." As Sera bore down with inhuman strength, the air around them began to shimmer. Harold watched in amazement as the emerging child seemed to glow with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with Sera's heartbeat. But there was something else. Shadows were creeping along the walls, reaching toward them with grasping tendrils. "They're coming," Sera whispered, her voice now purely human and filled with terror. "The others, they know." The diner's front door burst open, though Harold was certain he'd locked it. A figure stepped inside, tall, imposing, with features that seemed to shift between beautiful and terrible. Its eyes burned with cold fire, and when it smiled, Harold saw rows of teeth like broken glass. "Sister," the being said, its voice like wind through a graveyard, "you cannot hide from your nature forever. The child belongs with its own kind." "Raziel," Sera breathed, her face contorting with another contraction. "I cast you out once before." "And look where your rebellion has led," Raziel replied, stepping closer despite the obvious barrier that seemed to resist its approach. "The child will be born tainted by this mortal realm. It will know neither heaven nor hell, belonging to neither side." "Is that what you wanted?" Harold felt the baby's shoulders emerge and caught the tiny form in his hands. The moment his skin made contact with the child, visions flooded his mind, cities in flames, but also cities being built anew, wars ending but also new conflicts beginning. The future spread before him like a vast tapestry with threads of both gold and shadow. "Harold," Margaret whispered urgently, "look at the baby." He looked down and gasped. The child was perfect, absolutely perfect, but its skin seemed to contain galaxies, swirling patterns of light and dark that shifted constantly. Its eyes, when they opened, held depths that spoke of ancient wisdom and infinite possibility. Raziel took another step forward, and this time the invisible barrier crackled with energy. The child must choose, Sera. You know this. Heaven or hell, order or chaos. It cannot remain neutral forever. Sera, exhausted but defiant, struggled to sit up. It will choose when it's ready, not before. And in the meantime, Raziel gestured toward the windows, where more figures had appeared, some radiant, others wreathed in shadow. How long before this realm tears itself apart, trying to contain something so powerful? Margaret stood up slowly, her arthritic joints protesting, but her voice rang clear and strong. Maybe that's not our choice to make. She looked at Raziel with the same stern expression she'd once used on unruly grandchildren. Maybe the child needs time to grow up and decide for itself what kind of being it wants to be. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a musical note that resonated in their bones. As it did, the assembled angels and demons outside took a collective step back. Even Raziel's confident expression faltered. Harold wrapped the child in Sera's jacket and placed it in her arms. The moment mother and child connected, a wave of energy pulsed outward from the diner, washing over everything. The storm began to calm, the supernatural cold receded, and the assembled host outside slowly began to fade. "This isn't over," Raziel said, but its voice had lost its commanding tone. "The child will face this choice eventually." "Yes," Sera said, looking down at her baby with exhausted love, "but not today. Today, it gets to simply exist." As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in gentle pastels, the last of the supernatural beings vanished. The diner stood quiet, except for the soft sounds of a newborn child and the gentle whispers of three mortals who had just helped change the course of eternity itself.